So, welcome to week 2 of the Science of Mind Body Healing. This week, we're really going to get into it. We're going to start talking about stress and the body and the systems that it impacts, which, spoiler alert, it's all of them. But this is where it can start to get a little heavy when we're talking about disease and discomfort. It's a normal thing to feel emotional discomfort or feel a little stressed out, and that's not what we want if we're working on limiting our stress or minimizing our stress. So feel free to pause whenever you need, have a few deep breaths, and then I hope you'll keep going and get to the end of what we have to say today. So, to start, I want to lay down kind of what stress is. We use that word a lot, but it means very specific things, and we kind of throw it around for other experiences and other emotions. So I really want to lay that down. And I've got the traditional psychological definition of stress, which is an uncomfortable emotional experience accompanied by predictable biological, physiological, and behavioral changes. So we've got biochemical, we've got physiological, and we've got behavioral. And we can see all of those things once we get into it. But an example of that would be an activation in our HPA axis, which we brought up last week, could cause something like the slow digestion in our digestion system. That's the physiological response. And then the behavioral changes could be something like feeling a discomfort in our stomach and rubbing it, or slowing our eating to adjust for that physiological response. We'll go into that more in depth when we go system by system in that response. But stress is a very specific kind of series of things that is spurred by a stress reaction or an emotional reaction in our brain. And stress isn't all bad. Acute stress, which is like a short burst of stress, is arguably a really healthy and motivating thing. We need stress to survive. For example, if we step into the road and there's a car or a bike coming, we need the stress response to be able to jump out of the way and keep ourselves safe. So all stress isn't bad. It's a response to our environment. The problem is when we're constantly activating that response, or when we see it for long periods of time, that we start to see problems, but we'll get to more of that. Chronic stress as well, which is long-term stress, is also a survival mechanism, but it's where it starts to get more dangerous physically and emotionally, and we start to see patterns and long-term chronic effects. And that's where we need to mediate those things. And that's why we're doing this course, is to look at what the long-term effects of chronic stress are and how we can negotiate that and mediate that. So in situations of chronic stress, there are ones that organically occur through tragedies like war or famine, the concentration camps in World War II. I would argue that chronic poverty is a pretty serious one that most of us are facing right now, worldwide, but in North America as well. And what chronic stress is in these situations, it's your body's survival mechanism. It's your body working really hard to keep you alive in a situation that's not ideal for your body to be alive. What's cool and what I find really interesting is in these situations of chronic stress, the way we think and the way we approach that stressful situation not only has a significant effect on our emotional state, but it actually has an effect on our physical body and on how well we survive that and our long-term health after that chronic stress situation or throughout that chronic stress situation. If we look at kind of historical situations, World War II and the concentration camps was obviously a huge issue when it comes to chronic stress and tragedy and loss and all of these really, really difficult emotions and really difficult situations. But Viktor Frankl, who is himself a Holocaust survivor and went on to be a psychiatrist, wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning about his experiences in a concentration camp. And he argued, and there is evidence to back this up, that the prisoners who survived were the ones who showed the most resilience and the ones who worked to create narratives of meaning and optimism and hope. And so this this understanding of meaning in your life and of optimism and of hope. And we'll talk about that at the end. That doesn't have to be all bunnies and sunshine. It's a way of approaching difficult situations and telling ourselves about those situations that actually has a very real physical effect on our body's ability to function and our body's ability to survive. And what we're doing in this course is we're looking at all of those pieces to that mental part and building up resilience and building strategies and building coping mechanisms so that if we are in a stressed out situation or a stressful situation, we have those mechanisms to bump up our optimism and our hope and our meaning, and hopefully take down our stress response and take down the danger in that. So that's what this course is all about. In my next course, which is to be announced, The Art of Mind-Body Healing, we'll go deeper on things like meaning and hope and narratives, but that's in the works, so we'll get there. Or maybe when you're seeing this, it's already been released. So yeah, but back to last week, we looked at the brain, and we left it at the hypothalamus, which is that control center. I suggested the image of an air control table, desk, and it's the control center of your physiological response. So what the hypothalamus is doing is it's communicating with other systems in your body and preparing you for a survival situation. So fight or flight is the term that we're all familiar with, where you see a threat and you're either going to fight it or you're going to run away. There's more levels to that, but we'll get to that later. So yeah, the first thing I want to touch on, which we're going to talk about less, is the HPA axis, which is one of the systems that the hypothalamus is going to communicate with when we're in a stressful situation. And what the HPA axis is it's the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the adrenal glands. And it's it is the hormonal response to stress. So the hypothalamus, which we covered last week, is that command center. The pituitary gland is located near the base of the brain, and it communicates with the hormonal systems in our body. It's also the thing that activates at the beginning of puberty to tell our hormonal systems to start going through puberty. So it's the brain system that's communicating with any hormonal system in the body. And then the third thing is the adrenal glands. And this is the hormonal system of the stress response. It's located near the kidneys, and it secretes cortisol and adrenaline, which allow the body to react quickly. We all know that adrenaline, adrenaline is that boost of energy we get in an emergency situation or in a stressful situation or when we're watching scary movies. The adrenaline is that burst of energy that we need. And cortisol is used in the body to regulate inflammation and influence our sleep and wake cycle and lots of other things. And neither of these things are a problem in of themselves. They're both hormones that exist in the body and that we need for our regular function of our body. But if we're seeing an overactivation of these systems and seeing too high of levels of cortisol or too much adrenaline too often, that's where things start to become problematic. And that's where we start to see system overloads and burnout in that. So yeah, anything I talk about really throughout this course in of itself isn't a negative response. It's the overactivation of those things that becomes dangerous. So that's all I'm really going to say about the HPA system. It's our hormonal response to stress. It exists so that if we're in a stressful situation, we have the hormonal support to get out of it. For the purpose of what we're doing, I want to focus more on the autonomic nervous system, which runs all throughout our body and starts with that hypothalamus activation as well. And what the autonomic nervous system is actually our fight or flight versus rest and repair system. So it's two systems. It's the parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and repair system, and our sympathetic nervous system, which is our fight or flight. And what happens or what those systems do is they control all of our involuntary bodily functions. So that's all of our breathing, our blood pressure, our heartbeat, our dilation or constriction of blood vessels and airways. It's all of the systems in our body, and it communicates with them and tells them whether to activate or slow down. It directs blood flow to different parts as we need them. And it's negotiating how rested or how stressed we are. So yeah, to go deeper into that, the autonomic nervous system, because it's really the key point for what we're doing and what we're looking at. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response, and we've all heard about that. That is our stress response. When we're in a stress situation, our sympathetic nervous system is the one that lights up across the board. And what happens is when we're in a state of stress, our body diverts its resources to only essential systems. Anything that's seen as non-essential in the moment for survival is kind of put on the back burner, and all of our resources go to those really essential self-preservation systems, which is amazing and great. But what happens is if we're seeing an overactivation of the sympathetic nervous system, what we're seeing is chronic inflammation and things like muscle tension, digestion issues, heart disease, that kind of thing, because we're putting those systems in a state of hypervigilance and hyperactivation. So to go through each system specifically, I'm just going to touch on each one. You've got a chart in your ebook, which kind of says the main system, what the initial response is, and then what the chronic and long-term issues are when that's activated for too long. So if you want to look at that little chart, it might help you get an idea, but I'll just touch on each one. One of the most obvious ones, which we all can probably do right now, is like things like dropping our shoulders or rolling our shoulders or releasing our jaw, is our musculoskeletal system is implicated in our autonomic nervous system. And what's happening is if we're preparing to fight, our muscles tense up to guard against injury or pain and to prepare us to either run away or be in a fight. But what happens is if we're in a state of chronic stress, we're always clenching some of our muscles as a preparation for the oncoming stress. And that can lead to serious neck and back problems, chronic pain because of that tension, and those types of issues. And that's an obvious one. We all know that one. Another one we all kind of know is the cardiovascular system. We know that stress is implicated in heart disease and hypertension. And that's because when we're in an activated stress response, our heart rate goes up, our heart beats faster, stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol carry messages through our blood. Our major blood vessels dilate to allow extra blood flow. But the problem is with chronic stress or a repeated activation of an acute stress is that the wires kind of become crossed and we see things like heart attack and stroke and hypertension. So it's interesting to note in the cardiovascular system, which is one of the systems we have the most data on, that it is long-term chronic stress or repeated acute activation that causes these long-term problems. The next system is the respiratory system, which is our breathing system. And we all know when we're in an athletic situation, we start breathing faster and more shallow to get oxygen into our brain as we're moving or being physically active. And if you're about to have the fight of your life or outrun a tiger, it makes sense that you need that shallow breath. But when we see long-term activation, what we see is complications like asthma or holding of breath or interrupted breathing, which then can cycle back and trigger our stress response because we're not breathing properly. So I'll get more into that in our exercises where we look at breathing. But breath is an important, not only indicator of where we're at in our stress response, but also an important way our body communicates back to our brain. Another really obvious one that we've all experienced, we talk about it in our language. We talk about our gut reaction, or having butterflies in our stomach, or having a knot in our stomach. Our gastrointestinal system is a huge part of our stress response. It's seen as a non-essential in an emergency situation, and so blood flow actually moves away from our gastrointestinal system to go to other systems like our muscles and our heart and our lungs. But what happens is, long term, this can cause issues in the movement through our digestive system and our digestion of food. And chronic stress will affect the mobility of your gastrointestinal system. And we see this in constipation and diarrhea, indigestion, acid reflux, bloating, all of those things. Irritable bowel syndrome, which is more commonly known as IBS, is actually the second leading cause of missed work in North America. The common cold is the first. And it's a serious thing that is affecting so many people, and a lot of it has to do or is related to our response to chronic stress and our gastrointestinal system being in a chronic state of deactivation, basically. So yeah, we all know that one, I think, quite intuitively, and we talk about it. But it's interesting to know that there is a real physiological response happening, and it isn't just butterflies in your stomach. It might be butterflies in your stomach, but there is a process going on behind that we've always known, and it's quite cool to get the science behind it. I've also put on here our endocrine system, which is has to do with our hormonal response. Our liver produces more glucose to provide extra energy in a fight or flight situation. And after acute stress, the body remetabolizes that glucose and returns to normal. But in a chronic stress situation, we're going to see an influx of glucose too often, and it's the liver that's one of the systems that's implicated in diabetes and issues with glucose production and reabsorption. So that's an interesting one. And then another one that I think intuitively we all know, but maybe don't talk about very much, is the reproductive system is significantly affected by stress. We all know that our libido is affected by stress. Our desire to have sex or be intimate has a stress component to it. But what actually happens as well is, in the male system, chronic stress can affect testosterone production and sperm production, and can cause erectile dysfunction and impotence. And these are physiological responses to stress and emotion. And in the female reproductive system, we see this in an interruption in your menstrual cycle, or an increase in the symptoms associated with PMS, like bloating, or negative emotions and mood swings, or cramping and pain. And then later in life, we also see implications in menopause. And for both parties, we see this as an issue for infertility. So for anyone trying to get pregnant, stress can be a component in that process, and looking at what your stress response is and what your stress levels are, because it makes sense that your body would be resistant to conceiving when you're in a stress state, just as a way to preserve your health and your safety. Your body has these kind of catch safes in them, and that's one of them. So now that I've loaded all the scary stuff off on you, what's really exciting and what I find interesting is we have an equal and opposite reaction to the fight or flight response, but we don't seem to talk about it. And it's only been in the last, I think about 40 years, that we've started to really look at what the equal and opposite is, and that's the rest and repair system. And that's our parasympathetic nervous system. And so we've always had a label for it, but looking at kind of what it means for our body to be in a state of rest and repair. Where does our energy divert itself to? How do those systems work when we're in a state of rest and we're able to calmly look at our systems, and our body is able to look at sending resources to healing and fighting inflammation and these types of things. So what's exciting for me and what we'll continue learning throughout this whole process is that through practicing relaxation techniques, we actually encourage our body to more often drop into that parasympathetic state. And what that actually does is it allows your systems time to repair themselves. And that's the healing part of the mind-body healing project that we're doing, is giving our body just that space and that time and permission to rest and to repair and to check out of this hypervigilant state that so many of us are in so much of the time. And using very, very simple breathing techniques and mindfulness and meditation techniques to really encourage the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system more often than we activate the sympathetic nervous system. So that's what we're going to try to do. Like I said earlier, evolutionarily, stress isn't a bad thing. In our bodies, stress isn't always a bad thing. It's an essential part of being alive. It's necessary to motivate us to do things, to take us out of dangerous situations, but it's chronic stress and an overreaching, I would say, kind of a general stress issue that is causing these issues, these health issues, and seriously implicating itself in our health and in our long-term lives. So yeah, I would argue that chronic stress, this overarching general stress, is at epidemic levels in North America right now. I can speak to North America because that's where I am. And looking at mental health issues is going to be an essential part of negotiating the long-term fallout of such high stress levels and such prolonged stress levels. But you're already ahead of the game because you're already doing this course. You're already learning how to heal yourself and how to give yourself space to look after yourself. And what that means is once you have that space and once you have that time for yourself, you can go out and start helping other people just create little moments of space in their day and in your day to try and activate that rest and repair system. And so for this week, I'm going to leave it at that. I know that's a lot of information. You can rewind and rewatch whatever you want. There is a meditation practice that is the next video, and you can start using that in your day-to-day to give yourself just a little space and a little time to try and rest, relax, and hopefully get some healing done. So I'll see you next week. Thank you very much.